October 25th, 1944. Dawn. The steel-gray waters off Samar Island lay still beneath a sky smeared with ash and salt. At 06:45 hours the horizon erupted, not with the rising sun, but with the silhouettes of 27 Japanese warships, battleships, whose guns could hurl shells the weight of automobiles, cruisers bristling with armor, destroyers cutting white scars into the sea. They came from the north, a steel avalanche bearing down on the thin American line. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on the bridge, his knuckles white against the rail. He could see them clearly, now through the haze, the pagoda masts of the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, her 18-inch guns trained forward like the fingers of a closing fist. Behind him, 6 escort carriers, jeep carriers, the men called them, thin-skinned and slow-wallowed in the swell, their flight decks crowded with planes that had not yet fueled, pilots still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Between those carriers and the approaching Japanese armada stood 7 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, 11 ships. Against 20-7. Evans turned to his crew. His voice carried across the deck, calm as Sunday service. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. He did not wait for orders. At 07:10 hours, the Johnston heeled hard to port and raced alone toward the enemy line, smoke pouring from her stacks, her 5-inch guns already firing. 1 destroyer against an empire's final gamble. This was the battle off Samar, a footnote in the larger saga of Leyte Gulf, itself the largest naval battle in history. But what happened in those waters that October morning transcended tactics and tonnage. It became something else entirely, a revelation of what men could do when outnumbered, outgunned, and offered no path but forward. The Japanese had come expecting to crush a defenseless fleet. What they found instead was a ferocity that defied calculation, a recklessness that seemed less like strategy and more like faith. And in the chaos of that morning, as destroyers charged into the teeth of battleship fire, the Imperial Navy encountered something it had not accounted for in its war plans, the possibility that Americans would not behave as rational actors should, that they would not retreat, that they would not surrender, that they would instead attack. The Japanese plan had been elegant in its ambition. Operation Shogo Victory Operation was the Imperial Navy's last coordinated offensive, a 3-pronged thrust designed to annihilate the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf and shatter the liberation of the Philippines. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force. 4 battleships, including the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. This armada had steamed through the Sibuyan Sea, endured relentless air attacks, watched the Musashi sink beneath the waves under the weight of 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Kurita himself had been thrown from his chair when a torpedo struck his flagship. Yet he pressed on, threading through San Bernardino straight in the night, emerging into the Philippine Sea at dawn with vengeance and desperation tangled in equal measure. The Americans had thought him retreating. Admiral William Halsey commanding. The mighty Third Fleet had taken the bait of a Japanese carrier force to the north. Empty carriers, their planes already spent, dangled as a lure. Halsey bit, racing north with his battleships and fleet carriers, leaving the northern approach to Leyte Gulf covered only by Rear Admiral Clifton. Sprague's Task Unit 77.4, 3 call sign, Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 7 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, ships built to shepherd convoys and provide air support for landing troops, not to duel with battleships. Their carriers had flight decks made of wood. Their destroyers carried torpedoes and 5-inch guns, pop guns, compared to the 14-inch and 18-inch rifles now bearing down on them. Purita's lookout spotted the American masts at 0644 hours. He could scarcely believe his fortune. Instead of Halsey's armored leviathans, he had stumbled upon the soft underbelly of the invasion fleet. His radio crackled with orders. General attack. Every ship for itself. Close and destroy. The Japanese sailors had endured 3 years of grinding attrition. They had fought at Midway and the Philippine Sea, watched their carriers burn and their aircraft vanish into the sea. They had been told that this battle, this final thrust, would turn the tide, that they would break through to the transports and supply ships cowering in Leyte Gulf, that they would slaughter the defenseless and drive the Americans back across the Pacific. They had been told to expect easy prey. What they did not expect was the Johnston coming straight at them. Commander Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma, a man who wore his heritage with quiet pride and fought with the kind of fury that left his own superiors uncertain whether to court-martial him or promote him. He had told his crew when he first took command, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go alone had better get off right now." No one got off? Now, with the Johnston's engines screaming at flank speed, black smoke billowing to lay cover for the carriers behind him, Evans drove his ship into torpedo range 10,000 yards, then 8, then 6. Japanese shells began to bracket the destroyer, geysers of water erupting white and green, the sound like freight trains tearing through the sky. At 0730 hours, Johnston fired her full spread of 10 torpedoes, then wheeled hard to starboard, her guns blazing at the cruiser Kumano. 1 torpedo struck. The Kumano's bow disintegrated, 30 feet of steel and fire collapsing into the sea. She fell out of formation, trailing oil and smoke, limping away from the battle. The first blood drawn, but the Japanese had found their range. At 0731 hours, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo slammed into the Johnston. 1 shell penetrated the bridge, killing or wounding nearly everyone inside. Evans was blown backward, his shirt shredded, 2 fingers torn from his left hand, shrapnel buried in his neck and face. The second shell destroyed the aft engine room, killing every man inside and cutting the ship's speed in half. The third shell detonated in the crew's quarters, turning steel bunks into shrapnel. Fire raced through the destroyer's guts. Power failed. Steering failed. For 5 minutes, Johnston drifted, burning and dead in the water, while the Japanese fleet closed around her like wolves on a wounded deer. Evans pulled himself upright, blood streaming down his face. He shouted orders through the smoke, his voice hoarse but steady. Damage control teams fought the fires. engineers rerouted power. At 07:35 hours, the Johnston shuddered back to life, her remaining engine clawing her forward at 17 knots, smoke still pouring from her wounds. She rejoined the fight. By now, the other destroyers had followed Evans into the maelstrom. The Hole, Herman, and Samuel B. Roberts charged the Japanese line, weaving through shell splashes that rose higher than their masts, firing torpedoes and guns with a desperation that bordered on madness. The destroyer escorts tiny ships, half the displacement of a fleet destroyer, armed with 3-inch guns, and crews barely out of training rushed forward alongside them. The Samuel B. Roberts, known affectionately as the Sammy B., closed to within 5,000 yards of a cruiser column before launching her torpedoes, so close that her crew could see Japanese sailors on deck, see the flashes of their guns, see the shells arcing toward them in flat, deadly trajectories. The Japanese had expected to sweep aside token resistance and proceed to the slaughter. Instead, they found themselves under attack. Torpedoes lanced through the water, forcing battleships to twist and turn, breaking their formations. Shells small by battleship standards, but arriving in relentless salvos, smashed into superstructures, started fires, killed officers on exposed bridges. Smoke screens laid down by the destroyers as they charged turned the battlefield into a maze of gray shadows where the massive Japanese ships, built to fight at 20,000 yards, found themselves blind and confused, firing at muzzle flashes and radar ghosts. Admiral Kurita, standing on the bridge of the cruiser Otago, began to waver. His formation was scattered. His ships were reporting torpedo attacks from multiple directions. His intelligence had told him he was facing escort carriers, yet these ships were fighting like fleet carriers, their escorts attacking with a ferocity that suggested desperation or fanaticism. He had lost the Kumano, he had lost cohesion, and somewhere in the smoke and chaos he began to lose his nerve. Aboard the Johnston, Commander Evans had lost steering control again. He maneuvered the ship from the fantail, shouting orders to men who cranked the rudder by hand, guiding the destroyer through a forest of shell, splashes by instinct and prayer. At 08:20 hours, a Japanese cruiser column bore down on the escort carriers, closing to 14,000 yards, shells straddling the Gambier Bay. Evans ordered the Johnston to interpose herself, one destroyer already crippled, placing herself between 4 cruisers and their prey. The Johnston's remaining guns opened fire, and for 12 minutes she dueled with cruisers that outweighed her 10-1, drawing their attention, absorbing their fire. The carriers behind her limped away, flight decks shattered, but still afloat. Crew of the Johnston knew they were dying. The ship listed 10 degrees to port, her hull riddled with holes, sea water pouring into compartments faster than the pumps could expel it. Gun captains fired manually when power failed, loading shells by hand, aiming by eye through smoke and flame. Torpedomen stood ready to launch their reloads until, keeping the one remaining engine alive through shear, will dot at 0930 hours, a salvo of shells large caliber, perhaps from the battleship Yamato, struck the Johnston amidships. The destroyer shuddered, her keel buckling, and began to die. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Men leapt into the oil-slicked water as the Japanese destroyers closed in, circling the wreck, firing into the sinking hull. At 0945 hours, the Johnston rolled to port, her bow rising skyward, and slid beneath the waves. Commander Ernest E. Evans went down with her. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. The hull sank at 0855 hours, her hull shattered by 40 shell hits and possibly 2 torpedoes, her crew swimming in the water as Japanese ships steamed past, some sailors later reporting that a Japanese officer on a passing destroyer saluted them as they floated among the debris. The Samuel B. Roberts took a 14-inch shell through her hull at 0851 hours, the explosion breaking her keel, and sank at 1005 hours after her crew fought fires and flooding for over an hour. By hundreds of shells, capsized at 0907 hours, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war, but the Japanese did not break through dot at 0911 hours. With the American carriers limping southward, with destroyers sinking and burning on all sides, with victory seemingly within his grasp, Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to disengage. He turned north away from Leyte Gulf, away from the transports and supply ships lying defenseless just beyond the horizon. His reasons have been debated ever since: confusion over American strength, fear of submarines, exhaustion from days of relentless air attack, the shock of facing resistance where he expected none. But the result was undeniable. The Japanese withdrew. The battle off Samar ended not in annihilation, but in survival. The men who floated in the water, survivors of the Johnston, Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier, they spent 2 days in the Philippine Sea before rescue ships found them. Sharks circled. Men succumbed to wounds, to exposure, to despair. Of the Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. Of the Samuel B. Roberts' 224 men, 89 were lost. But they had held the line. 11 ships against 27. And the 11 had won. The Imperial Japanese Navy had sailed into battle expecting to encounter the soft targets of a logistics fleet, to exercise the brutal arithmetic of superior firepower against inferior opponents. Their officers had been trained in the doctrines of decisive battle, the philosophy that overwhelming force applied at the critical point would shatter the enemy's will. They had the Yamato, whose guns could penetrate 16 inches of armor at 25 miles. They had cruisers and destroyers fresh from refit, crews disciplined and determined. They had every material advantage. What they did not have was the capacity to understand that destroyers might charge battleships, that men might fight not because victory was possible, but because retreat was unthinkable, that a ship already dying might place herself between the enemy and her sisters, not to buy time for escape, but simply because that was what one did. The Japanese sailors had been raised in a culture that revered sacrifice, that honored death before dishonor, that built its military ethos on the samurai code of Bushido. Yet at Samar they encountered a kind of ferocity that mirrored their own, and exceeded it not because the Americans sought death, but because they sought something beyond survival. The destroyers charged not to die gloriously, but to preserve the fleet behind them, to protect the carriers whose planes would support the soldiers on Leyte, to hold the line for men they had never met and never would. Of ceremony, pragmatic and terrible, an utterly relentless dot in the years after the war, Japanese officers who survived Samar spoke of it with a kind of bewildered respect. They described the American destroyers as suicidal, their attacks as reckless, their determination as incomprehensible. Admiral Kurita himself, in post-war interviews, struggled to articulate what had happened that morning, why his overwhelming force had been repelled by a handful of escorts. He spoke of confusion, of losses, of the need to reorganize. But beneath the tactical explanations lay something deeper, the sudden, disorienting realization that the Americans would not behave as defeated men should, that they would not recognize, when they were beaten, this was the gulf that could not be measured in tonnage or firepower. The Japanese had built an empire on the calculated application of force, on strategic surprise, on the belief that Western powers were decadent and weak. Pearl Harbor had been predicated on this belief that a decisive blow would shatter American will, that a nation accustomed to comfort and abundance would sue for peace rather than endure the hardships of war. But at Samar, the Japanese encountered the paradox. At the heart of American strength, the same abundance they scorned, the industrial might, who chose to fight not because their culture demanded it, but because they had chosen it themselves. The destroyers at Samar were not conscripts driven into battle by imperial decree. They were volunteers, men from farms and cities from Oklahoma and Texas and Ohio, who had signed up after Pearl Harbor, who had trained in the naval yards and on the shakedown cruises, who crewed their ships with a mix of professionalism and improvisation that would have horrified a Japanese naval academy. They called their commanding officers by nicknames. They were, by Japanese standards, undisciplined, and then the moment came, and they charged. The symbolic weight of that charge cannot be separated from the material reality of what the Americans brought to the Pacific. The escort carriers behind Taffy 3 were mass-produced, built in shipyards that turned out hulls the way Detroit turned out automobiles, quickly, efficiently, with an emphasis on quantity over elegance. The destroyers were Fletcher-class workhorses of the fleet, not the handcrafted marvels of Japanese naval engineering. Even the torpedoes they fired were products of a supply chain, so vast and impersonal that no single worker could claim ownership of the weapon. Yet in the hands of those crews, those mass-produced tools became instruments of defiance. The Johnston's guns, 5-inch .38s, were designed for anti-aircraft work, not for dueling with battleships. Yet her crew fired them until the barrels glowed red, until the ammunition hoists jammed, until the mounts themselves were blown apart. The Samuel B. Roberts had 3-inch guns, barely adequate for escort duty, yet she closed a knife-fighting range and put shells through the superstructures of heavy cruisers. The Japanese could calculate the odds, could measure the weight of broadside, could predict the outcome of the engagement with mathematical precision. What they could not calculate was the willingness of men to ignore those calculations. After the battle, when the survivors were pulled from the water, they did not speak in grand terms. They spoke of the cold, of the oil that coated their skin and choked their throats, of the sharks that circled and the friends who slipped beneath the waves. They spoke of Commander Evans' last words, of the way the Johnston had seemed to fight even after she should have been dead, of the strange silence that fell when the Japanese fleet finally turned away. They were not philosophers or poets. They were sailors, and they had done what sailors do, their duty to the last shell, to the last breath. But in the telling and retelling of their story, something larger emerged. Samar became a parable, a distillation of a certain American faith, not religious, not ideological, but something harder to name. The faith that small ships could challenge great ones, that ordinary men could do extraordinary things, that democracy, for all its mésalliances and inefficiency, could produce a ferocity equal to any empire's. The Japanese had built the Yamato as a symbol, a steel cathedral to the glory of the Imperial Navy. The Americans had built the Johnston as a tool, a machine for a job. Yet when the two philosophies met in the waters off Samar, the tool proved more enduring than the symbol. The Yamato survived Samar. She would sail again, one last time in April 1945, sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa, with fuel enough for a one-way trip, her orders to beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until she was destroyed. She never reached Okinawa. American aircraft found her in the East China Sea and put 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs into her hull. She capsized and exploded, taking over 3,000 men with her. She was the most powerful battleship ever built, and she died without ever fulfilling her purpose. The Johnston sank in 2,000 fathoms off Samar, her hull broken, her crew scattered. But she had fulfilled hers. In the decades since, historians have parsed the battle, analyzing Kurita's decisions, debating whether he could have pushed through, whether the American resistance was as effective as legend claims, or whether Japanese confusion and fatigue were the deciding factors. The arguments are intricate, the evidence debated. But the men who were there, who floated in the water and watched the Japanese fleet turn away, did not need hindsight to understand what had happened. They knew. They had charged into impossible odds and had made those odds recalculate. The recurring symbol of that morning, if one had to choose, was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something more ephemeral: the smoke. The destroyers and destroyer escorts laid smoke screens as they charged, pouring out thick clouds of gray and white that drifted across the battlefield, obscuring the carriers, confusing the Japanese gunners, turning the sea into a labyrinth. Tactic, almost primitive: hide in the fog and strike from the shadows. But there was poetry in it. The smoke was American industry distilled. The oil from Texas wells, the boilers from Pittsburgh steel mills, the engines designed in drafting rooms and assembled by riveters in Mare Island and Bath. It was the breath of abundance, the exhalation of a nation that could afford to burn fuel at prodigious rates, to cloak itself in waste product and turn that waste into a shield. The Japanese had no such abundance. They had come to Samar running on the last dregs of their fuel reserves, every gallon of oil precious, every maneuver calculated to conserve what little remained. When they fired their guns, they fired carefully, rationing shells, aware that resupply was a fantasy. The Americans, by contrast, fired until the barrels wore out, laid smoke until the sea was a gray purgatory, launched planes until the flight decks were empty, and then launched them again with whatever ordnance could be scrounged from the magazines. It was not skill or courage that made the difference. Both sides possessed those in abundance. It was the simple, brutal fact that the Americans could afford to be reckless, that they could waste shells and fuel and even ships, because there were more shells, more fuel, more ships coming. Always more. This was the reality that underlay the myth. The charge of the destroyers was not a miracle. It was the product of a system of vast and unglamorous machinery of production and logistics that stretched back across the Pacific to the shipyards and factories and farms of a nation that had never been bombed, never been invaded, never known the terror of enemy boots on its soil. The men who died at Samar were heroes, but they were heroes armed with the output of a democracy at war, a democracy that could turn its economy into a weapon and its citizens into soldiers without collapsing under the weight. The Japanese had believed in 1941 that this abundance was a weakness, that a people accustomed to comfort could not endure hardship, that a nation of individuals could not organize for collective sacrifice. Samar proved them wrong. The destroyers charged not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. And that choice, multiplied across millions of men and women and factories, in shipyards and fields and offices and training camps, was the force that the Japanese could not overcome. There is a photograph, taken in the days after the battle, of survivors from the Samuel B. Roberts aboard a rescue ship. They are young, most of them, barely out of their teens, hollow-eyed and oil-stained, blankets draped over their shoulders. They do not smile. They stare at the camera with expressions that are neither proud nor ashamed, only exhausted. They look like what they are, ordinary men who have done something extraordinary and survived, and who now must carry the weight of both. The war would grind on for another 10 months. The Japanese would fight with increasing desperation, would send kamikazes against the fleet, would die by the hundreds of thousands in the defense of Okinawa and the home islands. But after Samar, after the moment when 27 ships turned away from 11, something had shifted. The Japanese had seen the American fleet at its weakest and had failed to destroy it. They had been given the perfect opportunity. The carriers exposed, Halsey lured away, the path to Leyte Gulf open, and they had let it slip through their fingers, not because they lacked the firepower, but because they encountered a resistance that did not fit their calculations, that defied the logic of force ratios and materiel superiority, and in that defiance lay the seed of their defeat. The epilogue to Samar is written in the names on memorials. The rusting hulks found by deep-sea explorers in the Philippine Trench, the Medal of Honor citations and unit commendations that fill dusty archives. But it is also written in the silence that followed the battle, in the moment when the Japanese fleet turned away and the American sailors, floating in the water, realized they were still alive. That silence was the sound of an empire recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that it had miscalculated, that the Americans would not break, that the war could not be won. Commander Ernest Evans, in the minutes before the Johnston sank, stood on the fantail of his ship and watched the Japanese destroyers close in. His shirt was in tatters, his face covered in blood, his left hand wrapped in a makeshift bandage. Around him his crew prepared to abandon ship, lashing together rafts, helping the wounded over the side. An officer asked him if he was coming. Evans shook his head. He would stay with the ship. It was his ship. He had driven her into harm's way, had asked his men to follow him into impossible odds, and now she was dying. He would not leave her. The officer tried to argue, but Evans waved him off. There was no anger in the gesture, no drama, only a quiet finality. He turned back to the sea, watching the enemy destroyers, watching the carriers on the horizon, steaming away to safety. He had bought them time. His ship had bought them time. It was enough. When the Johnston slipped beneath the waves, the Japanese destroyer that had been closing on her stopped engines. On her deck, a Japanese officer raised his hand to his brow in salute. It was a gesture across the gulf of war, a recognition that transcended enmity. The Americans who saw it floating in the water did not know what to make of it. Later they would argue about whether it happened at all, whether the Japanese were capable of such sentiment. But those who believed it was real carried the memory, like a talisman, the moment when the enemy acknowledged that courage was not the province of empires alone. The Battle off Samar was not the largest engagement of World War II, nor the most strategically decisive, but it was perhaps the purest distillation of what the war was about, not the grand ideologies or the sweeping campaigns, but the moment when men faced the void and chose to fight rather than flee, when ships charged into the guns because someone had to, because the carriers behind them were full of young pilots who had not yet fueled their planes, because the soldiers on Leyte were counting on supplies that would not arrive if the Japanese broke through. It was not glorious. It was terrifying and chaotic and brutal, but it was also beautiful in the way that defiance is always beautiful, in the way that a small and dying thing can still bare its teeth and refuse to yield. The smoke cleared. The Japanese fleet retreated. The survivors were pulled from the water, counted, mourned, and the war rolled on, vast and impersonal, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. But for those who were there, for those who charged and survived, or charged and died, the moment remained vivid and sharp, a flare of light in the darkness, a proof that men could be more than the odds allowed, that destroyers could break battleship, lines that 11 could stand against 27 and hold. This is the legacy of Samar, not that the Americans won, but that they fought, that when the moment came when the steel avalanche bore down on them and every rational calculation screamed retreat, they turned into the storm and charged, and in that charge they became something more than sailors or soldiers or men. They became the embodiment of a truth larger than themselves, that freedom is not a gift bestowed by empires, but a fire kindled by those who refuse to be extinguished, that democracy, for all its flaws, can produce a courage equal to any tyrannies, that the line between victory and defeat is sometimes measured not in tonnage, but in will. The sea holds the wrecks still, deep in the darkness where the light does not reach. The Johnston lies in pieces, her hull crushed by the pressure, her guns silent. But the story of what she did, of what her crew did, endures. It endures in the classrooms where naval officers study the battle, in the memorials where families lay wreaths, in the quiet pride of a nation that remembers its heroes not because they were invincible, but because they charged anyway. 27 ships advanced, 11 stood in their path, and when the guns fell silent, the line had held.